My name is Nicola, aka Socrates, and you're watching Singularity FM, the place where we interview the future. If you guys enjoy this show, you can help me make it better in two ways. Number one, you can go and write a brief review on iTunes, or number two, you can go to interviewthefuture.com and simply make a donation. You know, people often ask me about my most favorite interview that I have ever done. And my usual answer that I always give to that common question is that interviews are like children. Basically, even if we have our own favorites, it is not very wise to share that publicly because all kinds of problems would follow. Well, after doing almost 250 interviews, I can say that I can hardly remember that I have ever done an interview that had had a greater impact on the way I perceive the world, the way I perceived concepts such as the technological singularity, technology in general, foresight, and transhumanism, as much as my first interview with Karl Schroeder. We did that interview 8 years ago, and we talked a lot about transhumanism and the technological singularity, as well as Karl Schroeder's background. So today I will try not to repeat any of those questions that we discussed last time. So if you guys missed that episode, I highly suggest that you start with it. So without further ado, you already know that my guest today, after an 8-year delay, is Canadian science fiction author and professional futurist Karl Schroeder. Karl, welcome to Singularity FM.
It's so good to be here again.
Fantastic. It's been 8 long years that I've been thinking and planning to do this interview, and I'm so happy we're finally here in my place today. So thank you for coming.
Well, and so much has changed in just the last 8 years that I think we have almost a complete reset to square one, and we have to start, talking from almost basic principles again.
And that's actually a very good point to start our conversation, because I was already planning to ask you, what were the major changes or shifts in your thinking that maybe occurred in the last 8 years since our last conversation?
I can never separate, my thinking from my writing. And I had, when we last spoke, I had written 9 novels set in the far future in different parts of the galaxy, sometimes thousands of years from now. And I had at the same time been writing a bunch of experimental short stories set around here and now. I'd been writing about a pathologically shy Ukrainian arms inspector named Gennady, who was kind of the anti-James Bond and kept getting into trouble around the world because he loved going to places where no one else would be, like Chernobyl. So my Gennady stories did really well, and I loved writing about him and about the setting, and at the same time, global warming and the ecological crisis that we're facing as a planet was becoming much more prominent and, well, inescapable. And I was a new father and had a daughter who was going to be growing up in this world. And at a certain moment, around the time my last book, Lockstep, came out, which is set 14,000 years in the future, around that time, I decided,
talking about the long view, 14,000 years into the future. Okay.
I decided I just could not keep avoiding writing about now. It was like I was whistling past the graveyard. Let's write about something else. Not this. And so I made a major change in my thinking and decided the next book was going to be written like 15 years from now, set 15 years from now, and that I would start not just directly facing, but embracing the moment that we're in. And learning to love the Anthropocene has been sort of my task over the last few years. And at this point, I'm very delighted with where I am, and I'm really excited about writing about the near future and thinking about the near future in new ways.
Speaking of that, let me interrupt you here for just 1 second and ask you, it used to be the case that the near future was easy because it was very predictable, because it was near, and the far future was hard. Now, I'm no science fiction writer, but tell me, is it true to say that the near future has become a lot more unpredictable and harder to write about than it used to be the case with everything that's going on right now with us in terms of politics, in terms of society, Brexit, Trump, climate change, confrontation between Russia and the West again, even the coronavirus? All those things create a mixture which I think make it very hard to look even 2 or 3 years ahead of time. And you're a professional futurist, so is it harder or easier now?
I think it is harder. And I think that it's hard enough that a lot of science fiction writers simply won't try. You can, to be clear, you can write about the near future. You can write about, say, 25 years from now, because it's sufficiently far away that you can make up whatever changes you want in some ways. And that used to be the space where we were writing about the technological singularity.
Right. 2045.
Right.
2020 to 2045, exactly 25 years.
Yeah, like nuclear fusion, it's always been a certain distance away that advanced as we
It's always 30 years away.
Yeah, exactly. But now all bets are off, and the future's sort of rushed upon us in strange ways from strange directions. And you can't write about 5 years from now, because 5 years from now is almost unimaginable.
Almost anything can happen within a very short horizon.
Yes, for instance, just to pick something from my futures pile, Elon Musk is claiming that the existing fleet of Tesla cars on the road will be fully autonomous by the end of this year. So
Musk has a history of a little bit
of exaggeration, but not that much exaggeration,
yes,
which is what makes it an interesting claim. And the capacity for disruption from that change alone is huge, but it comes at the same time that all kinds of other disruptions are happening. And it's when you have that tidal wave of different kinds of changes all happening simultaneously that people back off and go, wait, no, I can't write about this moment. But I think it's absolutely critical that we write about this moment.
Yes. What is this moment? How would you qualify this moment? Because one of the things that you guys as science fiction authors and professional futurists have to contend with is to separate signal from noise.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
So, and we are in a moment, historically, politically, socially, legally, ethically, where there's so much noise that it's really hard to separate the signal from the noise. So how do you separate one from the other, and what is the signal that you're getting? How do you qualify, consequently, that moment that we're in right now?
Mm-hmm. It's strange because, in fact, the world is absolutely no different than it was 50 years from now, right? The world is the world. It is what it was. And it's, again, not going to change in the future. So,
and yet it doesn't feel like the same world.
No.
It feels like it's not the world that it used to be 50 years ago. At the same time, I agree with you, and yet it is and it isn't.
Yeah. What I'm sort of enjoying lately, and again, coming back to the idea of enjoying living in the Anthropocene, is writing as if I were living in the 21st century. And I know a lot of people who are writing as if they were still living in the 20th century. And the 20th century comes with a whole bunch of ways of doing things. That's where we still had newspapers and TV news and radio that would all tell you the same things, perhaps.
We had a common story or narrative.
We had a common story, and that's the important thing to consider. If you go way back, say 3,000 years, we had knowledge as a kind of social construct that was co-created by people. So you had some people who were professional storytellers, but generally speaking, even they co-created stories with the people that they recited them to. So the Odyssey is a great example of a story that would be recited but co-created with the audience.
Oral tradition passed.
Yeah, oral traditions are like that, and they're intrinsically social and they're intrinsically metaphoric.
Yeah.
So the world that you lived in really didn't differentiate between fact and story.
Yeah.
But particularly with the invention of the printing press, we get suddenly this linearization of knowledge. Knowledge comes to you in specific channels from specific authorities.
King James Bible basically came out and said, all the other versions of the Bible, forget about them. This is the one version of the Bible.
Yeah.
And that's the official one, and all the other ones are heresies and need to be burned. This is the future Bible. This is how it's going to be. That's my understanding how it happened.
Yeah.
But at least the biblical story. Because before that, there were a number of competing, I don't know if competing is the right word, but different narratives around that story, the Jesus story.
Yes. In fact, there were many of them, and it was accepted that people understood it in different ways. But throughout particularly the 20th century, what we had was a war among specific narratives, each of which was linearly constructed and basically as a state operation.
Capitalism, communism, fascism.
Yeah. And what we've had happen in the last few years is to quote Nietzsche, the sponge wiped away the horizon, right? Somebody has sort of taken that whole neat way of understanding the world and erased it for us. And the
work makes no sense today, precisely because we don't have a narrative which kind of explains all the things that are happening together in a cohesive, digestible, predictable, comforting, or understandable way.
We don't have a 20th century style narrative, which is the kind of narrative we grew up with.
Yes.
But that doesn't mean that we can't have a coherent, even true, and comfortable narrative. It just has to be a new way of understanding the world. And this is what we're very rapidly moving into right now. So you can see the current moment as the loss of coherence in the world, when we are in the middle of losing all of these linear, structured, comprehensible worldviews that we've had.
Stable and predictable.
Yes, but you can also look at this as a liminal moment of opportunity when we we're somewhat forced to retreat from trying to construct grand narratives, but that also means that those grand narratives no longer have the power to overwhelm us as societies the way they once did. In other words, there's really no equivalent right now to the communist threat, for instance, right? As an ideology, and a lot of people are currently afraid of right-wing ideologies and ultranationalism,
or of socialists coming to power, like quote Bernie Sanders and others.
Sure, but
since we're in the Democratic primaries.
Yes, but others are arguing, and I think quite rightly, that those narratives don't have the power they once had either. They're flags of convenience for people. They're great rallying points because there's already a sort of pre-mixed set of rhetoric and stories built around them, but they don't really fit either to the current moment. What we have instead is massive co-creation of friable narratives, things that come and go on an almost daily basis. It's what we're looking for is something that's familiar in the sense of the stable, long-term view of the world that we had in the past. But
linear, yeah.
And what we have instead is a world that becomes a new world every day. And this is terrifying, but it might not be a reason to be terrified. It might just be the way that we understand things. Maybe we're not drowning. Maybe we're surfing.
I really hope you're correct. So we will talk about that a lot more further on. So if you were to put the current moment in a sentence, how would you qualify it then? What kind of how would you characterize it? What's its predominant feature? Is it that sort of fluidity, or what is it?
I think it's a return to mythological thinking and the narratives of the ancient world, but with modern scientific fact as our sources. But
part of the problem is that the narrative of some people has at least, if not complete lack of tolerance towards scientific facts, they have what they call, quote, alternative facts.
Mm-hmm. Alternative facts are interesting because you can you can go a long way with them rhetorically and politically, right?
Yeah, sure. You can go a long way, of course.
Sure, but in a world that's profoundly interconnected, you can't.
People have gone a long way
sure.
to the White House,
but they don't have the power to take over the world the way that a fact-based narrative could.
Well, they helped a person take over a country, politically
sure.
speaking.
Sure, and that's a great red herring, because taking over a country is nothing at all like taking over the world.
But it's one of the most powerful and largest, I think it's like, what, the third or fourth largest countries in the world. And after, Russia and Canada, I think US is probably third largest in terms of geography. It's also arguably the most powerful mm-hmm. militarily and economically.
Sure. And when I go to the US, I don't find a place that's been monolithically conquered by alt-dot ideas.
Right.
I find a place that is dynamic, alive, where there are as many different narratives about the world as there are people. Mm-hmm. The traditional establishment institutions might have been hijacked, but are they as relevant as they were in the 20th century? Mm-hmm. That's another question to ask. Where does power actually flow from in the 21st century? Mm-hmm. Donald Trump was right that it's coming from a different direction, and he exploited Twitter
right.
very, very well. But he also doesn't know everything about how it works, and none of us do. So there's no equivalent of a kind of backroom cabal of KGB that are able to pull the strings on all of the misinformation and pseudoscience and everything else that's going on in the world. My take on alternative facts is that they will be controlled by what everything else on this planet is controlled by, natural selection. If they actually work, then they will thrive. If they don't work, they may have the power of memes and spread far and wide, like anti-vax ideas, for instance, for a while. But ultimately, they'll fail.
But they could work in the sense that, for example, and that would be, debatable point, and some people may even get a little insulted, but I'm going to say it anyway. So for me, an alternative fact is that Jesus rose from the grave, mm-hmm. right? That to me is an alternative fact. And yet, the Western civilization, the Western world has been a Christian world. And so that kind of alternative fact gave birth to a story that united, all of Europe and conquered, half the world, and basically led us through the Dark Ages and thereafter. Mm-hmm. And it's still very powerful in a lot of places up to this day in the 21st century. So I don't know what you mean by would they work, because it doesn't matter in a way, and Yuval Noah Harari talks about that a lot. It doesn't matter whether, according to him, a story is true or false. It's absolutely irrelevant. What matters is whether people believe it or not. Mm-hmm. So those alternative facts may be false, may not work in terms of historical or scientific accuracy, but as long as they have captured people's story, narrative, and imagination, they would have impact in the world for as long as that's the case. And so in that sense, they work. Mm-hmm. Even though you can't argue with gravity or with historical facts like, let's say, evolution and dinosaur fossils, and yet people argue with all of those and say that gravity is a theory or evolution is a theory, and the Earth is 7,000 years old or 8,000 years old or something like that, right? Mm-hmm. And in Kentucky we have Noah's Ark built, yes. And it was like, I don't know, $200 million, and they have 1 million visitors a year there, and all of that.
Mm-hmm. No, you're absolutely right. It is possible that some alternative fact will become the new world order for the next
new narrative
1,000 years. It is possible.
For our whole civilization, not just in Kentucky, but for the whole planet.
Yeah. But I would say it doesn't look like that's likely, because we live in a moment of divergence rather than a moment of convergence, where it is easier than ever before to have your own facts, right? Mm-hmm. In other words, my take on this is that we're going back to the time before the linear world narratives. And Christianity is arguably one of the first of those totalizing points of view. But the current moment, and it was Marshall McLuhan who first talked about modern media in this sense. At this moment, the media that we use and consume seem to push us back to the pre-literate way of understanding and expressing the world. And in that, you do have all kinds of alternative facts. You do have all kinds of pseudoscience and competing perspectives. Yeah, fake news everywhere. But it doesn't have the kind of power that it used to, because it doesn't have the ability to control or create that monolithic, totalizing point of view. And it's not necessarily because of the ideas, it's because of the media that they're being expressed in. This was McLuhan's big idea, that just from the fact that you're using television instead of radio, you no longer have the ability to control the message the way you did. Mm-hmm. So he contrasted the world of 1930s Germany with the world of 1960s America as being fundamentally different in what was possible, because there were different media being used. And now that we have the internet, this is amplified even more. So what do you have when you have a kind of a Hindu pantheon of competing perspectives the way we do now?
But here's the thing, and one of the books that I was reading as part of my preparation for this conversation with you is a book that we mentioned during our last interview that you wrote 16 years ago or so, in 2004, called Lady of Mazes. Mm-hmm. And that book had a lot to do with, as you said, the culture of technology and the technology of culture, but a big part of it was the ability to kind of choose your realm, technologically speaking, and the ability to tune on or off all kinds of features, people, geographical locations, or events around you, mm-hmm. based on your predisposition. And in that way, you can say perhaps it was kind of anticipating the augmented reality or the virtual reality that we're entering right now slowly. And in a world where we're kind of able to create our own bubble, first with social media, get into sort of the echo chamber politically and socially and religiously that we feel most comfortable in. Then with those added benefits of augmented reality and virtual reality, we can even more fine-tune to only see these kinds of things that we perceive are of value to us, whether they are alternative facts or not. Mm-hmm. And wouldn't that then allow us to manipulate that even more so than before, and therefore completely exclude all of our other realities, which then in turn would lead to exactly that point you're talking about of divergence of narratives. And then isn't then the concern is that we cannot maybe, or it would be very hard to peacefully coexist with each other if we have such radically divergent worldviews, where they're mutually exclusive in many cases, and yet we're all forced to live on the same rock called planet Earth, mm-hmm. with limited resources and in sort of a crisis situation when, as far as the climate goes, and maybe the biosphere and the oceans and species extinction and so on. Mm-hmm. And isn't it better or safer or even necessary to have some kind of a uniting narrative so that, isn't that kind of inevitable in a way if we are to survive even?
It might be, but it's a weird combination of those two extremes. And I played with this a lot when I was writing Lady of Mazes. That you had places like the archipelago where people just made up their own realities. But there was a meta layer above that had to be there for that process to actually happen. In order for us to be able to have our separate bubbles, we have to cooperate. So there's a paradox inherent in the very heart of this divergence. That we can only do it because we're acting together. And now I'm going in a slightly different direction with my new work around the idea of constraints, which I'm very, very excited about.
Freedom within limits, I think you said in the book.
Yeah, and it's because as an artist, as a creator, you very quickly learn that the best way to be truly creative is to be given a constraint.
Absolutely.
So the classic example is haiku, right? A certain number of lines, certain meter that has to be fulfilled. Or in music, the sonata form, which is a fast movement, slow movement.
Or in camera, now I sold all my camera with all my lenses, and I'm buying a camera with a single fixed focal range, 35 millimeters. And I'm saying, if Henri Cartier-Bresson and all the greats of the 20th century were fine with a single 35 millimeter lens, why do I need 10 different lenses, Right. And many people say that it has made them reinvent themselves and be a lot more creative, being forced to work with a single camera with a single fixed lens and not being able to do anything else.
Right. And that moment of reinvention, I think, is the moment that we're living right now. And it's because we're coming out of an era where we understood change in a particular way, that change was causal. A makes B makes C, right? And some of us thought in system terms of A makes B makes C makes A, but that was much better. But it's interesting when you start thinking in terms of constraints. With a constraint, you can't do this, but everything else is possible. So let's imagine it this way. So you're here and you can go in any direction, infinitely, right? So you have infinite possibilities. Yeah,
the sphere of possibilities.
Right. So say I place a wall here.
A border, yeah.
Yeah.
Or a limit.
It's a limit. So you cannot go that way anymore. But your potential is still
180
infinite,
degrees.
Right?
Yeah.
It's still infinite under constraint. And for me, the creative moment is when we realize that we don't have to linearly go from, the past, using our past into institutions, ways of understanding and so forth, and our ways of cooperating with one another into the future, but realize that we just are suddenly in a moment of constraint where unless we address the global situation that we're in, particularly climate change, and do so all together, we just don't keep going. That's a constraint. And all that constraint does is say what we can't do. It doesn't say what we can do. And infinite possibility is in front of us. So that the fact that we are diverging is not a problem, because none of us are getting through that constraint. Mm-hmm. We're all sort of channeled in the same creative direction. And the fact that we're not being controlled in some causal way or ideological way, or even in terms of a shared vision of what we want, is actually a good thing, because the creativity at this moment is infinite.
Maybe we are getting to be more and more controlled, if you are to believe Cambridge Analytica and the fact that the tech behind Cambridge Analytica was very crude and rudimentary, mm-hmm. and that tech is getting better and better all the time. We're becoming more and more predictable. As Tristan Harris says, basically all the big tech companies have these supercomputers where they have a voodoo doll simulation of you that they can use to make predictions about what you desire, what you fear, what you dream of, and basically kind of manipulate you towards their own benefit within that kind of predictability that they have extrapolated from the data that they have gathered from you.
Sure, but that's a complete sham, because they may be able to do so for you, but because you are one element of a giant complex adaptive system, as soon as they have to predict you and me and him and like maybe one other person, predictability as such completely goes out the window.
Mm-hmm. You're saying complexity ruins, so you can predict on us one by one, but as soon as you have like multiplicity of such predictions, then the concoction of those predictions starts influencing on each other to the degree that the total prediction is impossible?
Yes. But it's not just that it's impossible, it's irrelevant, because Cambridge Analytica is just as constrained by that wall as the rest of us. The fact is that there is a real world out there, independent of us, and it is calling the shots now.
But now the problem is that many people still refuse to see that. Many people are still locked into their own realm.
But my point is that it doesn't matter.
They'll be hard crushed and forced to wake up to it sooner or later, is what you're saying.
It doesn't matter whether they wake up to it sooner or later.
Yeah, because they'll just go extinct if they don't.
I don't like to frame this as an adapt or die situation. What I'm trying to say is that our knowledge of the world is not as important as the fact of it.
Right.
And the facts of the world right now create a certain set of constraints that we are going to work within, period. Mm-hmm. And whether we even know that we're doing it is not relevant. And whether we're trying to control one another while we do it is not relevant to the fact of it. Mm-hmm. So the important political actor right now is not human. And it's also not a artificial intelligence or a computing system. It's not the stack. It's the actual physical environment that we're embedded in. And that political actor is changing everything. So there is a rear guard of people who are still living in the 20th century and would like to be able to control things in a linear way, who are right now, as we speak, trying to construct sort of 1984 type dystopian states that they can control.
Right, China and Israel and
in that traditional,
maybe North Korea, like the United States even, of course, and all those.
In that traditional 20th century way, ignoring the fact that it didn't work in the 20th century. But nothing about our situation is the same. The technology, the media, again, just introducing television changes so much.
But the idea is that, as Yuval Noah Harari says, the reason why it didn't happen in the 20th century is because we didn't have first, we didn't have the data.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, we didn't have the computing power. Even if we did have the data, which we didn't, but even if we did have the data, we didn't have the computing power to process that data.
Sure, but even
he says today with technology, we're able to do both of those. We're able to acquire the data and compute.
Yeah, and my current novel, Stealing Worlds, is about that. In Stealing Worlds, there are a number of states around the world that are trying to do exactly what you're describing. They're trying to simulate and then control down to the individual level people and their choices. But the problem again is if you read, even Stephen Wolfram in A New Kind of Science, shows how you can create a simple cellular automata program of 5 or 6 elements that is, even in principle, utterly unpredictable.
Yeah. It gets infinite complexity or something like that.
Yeah, and that arises naturally and instantly with any small group of people. So this idea of control based on knowledge does not scale. Mm-hmm. So
that's actually profound ideas here that you're sharing, and it basically goes against much of what Yuval Noah Harari and many other super famous people and popular people in demand right now are saying. So that's why I'm bringing you here. That's why I feel so guilty of having waited 8 years before, because last time we had this conversation, I had such equally profound sort of illumination. So I'm really appreciative of how you're able to twist my perception and challenge, even established presumptions.
Well, let's follow this down the rabbit hole.
Absolutely.
For a second, because you can take this back to the idea of constraint. Well, maybe I can't control what people do, but maybe I can constrain what they do. And this might be the brand of totalitarianism that we have in the future. You simply flat out prevent people from being able to do certain things. You illegalize them or make them physically impossible. But the interesting thing about that is that, again, their options for what they cannot do may have been reduced, but their options for what they can do can still flourish. So it could be a society that we profoundly dislike, but it could be a society in which creativity and happiness still flourish. It's an interesting possibility.
And that's, to be honest, it never even occurred to me to think of it the way you're describing it, but I like the metaphor that you said, that you can put a limit here into the sort of the 360-degree future sphere of possibilities and limit it to, let's say, 180-degree, cut half of it out, and yet within those 180 degrees you still have infinite possibilities. I think that's very, very well said.
There's another way to look at it, which was come up with by a systems thinker named Ross Ashby. It's called Ashby's Law of Requisite Variety, which sounds strange and is strange in some ways. It's the idea that for any system, the part that controls it has to have as much internal diversity as the system itself. To take an example, if you have a stoplight with 3 colors, mm-hmm. red, yellow, and green, mm-hmm. you have to have a switch that has at least 3 states, right? To switch into each of those, right? So if you think of a government that's trying to control its people, it has to have the same amount of diversity within it and diverse points of view as there are in the population being governed. So there's 2 ways that you can then manage the system. You can either increase your own diversity so that your governing system becomes as diverse as what's being governed.
Or diminish.
Or diminish the complexity of what you're trying to... and that's another way of looking at this moment, that there are 2 kinds of governments around the world. Ones that are trying to increase their internal diversity, and whatever you may think of its successes and failures, this was the stated objective of the Trudeau government. to have internal representation of all the stakeholders, right? Women, Aboriginals,
indigenous people,
and then you have governments around the world that are taking the opposite strategy to reduce the complexity or the diversity of...
China and the Uyghurs is probably a good example of that.
Yeah.
Right? We're going to make them Chinese, basically. I think that's their solution. They'll think like Chinese, they'll speak Chinese, they're not going to be allowed to pray or speak their language or be Muslim, so complexity reduced to uniformity.
Right. Now, it's interesting when you talk to systems thinkers, they're a very different breed of person, because when you present them with this what seems to be a black and white choice, they say, well, a smorgasbord. And they say, well, in this kind of situation, for this kind of system, I would do it this way. So in a supermarket, for instance, I would simplify things. I would have aisles with simple labels at the top that say dairy, right? And you reduce the visible diversity to allow people to get around. And they would say in government, well, sometimes you want to increase your internal diversity, and sometimes you want to simplify. The question for them becomes one of tactics. Are you machine gunning people so that you get rid of a subculture that you don't want?
Right.
Or are you creating, for instance, educational standards? These are both ways doing exactly the same thing, right, of reducing the diversity within the population. So for systems thinkers, it's you're suddenly standing beyond the moral, ethical stance of, totalitarianism versus democracy and things like that, and you're looking down basically at humanity as something that will be, governed in one way or the other, but for which you have this smorgasbord of choices. When we look in fear at what governments around the world are doing to their people, we should probably remember that there are limits to both of these approaches, and sort of hard limits to what they can actually accomplish and how far they can go. Mm-hmm. And that as the system changes, the best way to govern it changes. So nothing is sort of permanent and fixed. As a nation or people evolve, how they their internal diversity will change, mm-hmm. And how they govern themselves will hopefully match that as it goes along.
Right. There's so many questions that I have on that topic, but I think this is a good point to finally bring in your latest book into our conversation, which is called Stealing Worlds. I just finished reading it, and let me share with you sort of my journey through the pages of this book. So the first third of the book, I was like, I can't quite connect with the narrative here. It's kind of like, it's okay, but I don't quite get it. It's not quite engaging me. The second third of the book, I was like, this is getting really good here. This is really, really getting good. It's very interesting, and I'm starting to kind of get it. The last third of the book, I was like, holy cow, this is blowing my mind now. There's so many things that I never thought of that are happening, and I thought the book is kind of like not so good originally in the beginning, and then it's like, wow, there's so many ideas about the future of governance, of society, of resolving issues such as climate change and the usage of blockchain, smart money, and all kinds of other ideas that it literally ended up blowing my mind in the end. So that was kind of like my journey through the pages. But in the end of the day, the moral of the story for me is I'm going to be rereading that book. Because even though a few pages I had to reread a few times just to get the idea and to be like, oh my goodness, it never even occurred to me to think about these things this way, I think I'm going to be redoing it. And there's many interesting ideas that I'm going to steal from it. Stealing worlds, I'm going to be stealing words from it. But let me ask you this. Let's talk a little bit about the book specifics. What is the book about, and when is it situated?
I really wanted to write a book in the here and now, or as close to it as possible. But I also wanted to be cool, so I eventually moved the narrative about 15 years out so that I could have self-driving cars and weak AI and things like that. But
I'm more with you on that timeline than with Elon Musk.
Oh yeah.
Because, and I didn't comment, but I'm going to use this opportunity because, you know, it's also about the definition of what autonomous self-driving car is, and where does it work. Because for him, he can say, well, we almost have self-driving cars, but, you know, on the Los Angeles highway or something like that. To me, a self-driving car is you drop one off in the middle of Mumbai when there have no traffic lights, no signs, no rules of anything, and you have cows and donkeys and everything left, right, and center in the middle of Africa,
right.
And then get from one point to another point entirely autonomously. Then for me, and only then for me, in my definition, can we say that we do have autonomous self-driving cars. That's why I'm more with you that it's not going to be 2021 or let alone 2020. It's going to be more like 2030, 2035 maybe, but it's surely not this or next year.
Well, you see, that's exactly what I wanted to write about. I wanted to write about that moment before the technology works. Because we have so many narratives about fully established artificial intelligence and fully established space flight and robotics and stuff like that. And Sura, the protagonist in the book, sees her first robot about 150 pages in. And it's like helping roof a house, right? And it's like, huh. But they're not everywhere. They're not carrying her groceries, right?
They're just coming in.
And the self-driving cars are just coming in. And the augmented reality is just coming in. It's that moment of
transition
and teetering between...
two ages or epochs?
Well, yes, but even just between competence and failure for so many of these things, right?
Sure.
So you can imagine every single one of the companies making all the tech in Stealing Worlds as not being there 5 years later, right? Because they've all gone out of business for one reason or another. This is that moment of uncertainty.
Including for our civilization.
Sure. That's what the book is about. I call it pre-apocalyptic fiction. It's trying to describe that moment when the world could go either way. And the thing about it is that because we're living in this sort of new mythological time.
Are we in this kind of moment?
Well, I thought we might be. If we are, then you can't describe it in a journalistic sort of way. You can't say it was the year 2035, right? This was happening in China. This was happening. No, we're looking through the eyes of Sura Neelan, who's this 28-year-old slacker with a high school education, who really isn't that interested in politics or what's going on anywhere else in the world. And even if she was, wouldn't be able to put together a better picture of what's going on than anybody else.
That's kind of Lydia in the Lady of Mazes almost.
Livia is the ultimate amplification of that, and there's a good reason for that, because Stealing Worlds and Lady of Mazes are directly connected. They're set in the same universe, and Stealing Worlds, Lady of Mazes, and my first novel, Ventus, share a timeline, ideas, and even characters. On the very first page of Ventus, you'll find a quote by someone named Marjorie Cadil, who ends up being a major character in Stealing Worlds. Absolutely. So, yes, these threads go through all of those works. But Sura is experiencing this sort of shattering of the world the way that we're experiencing it, as just weird news coming from all directions at once, as she is trying to make her way in the world. And what she discovers is that everybody else is having exactly the same experience, and some of them are reinventing the way they live in the world, and are doing much, much better than they were when they had traditional jobs in a traditional economy in a traditional country. So that's what I wanted to create with Stealing Worlds, and I hope I did.
And yet, most people are not that case in the book. I think you say several times that most people don't have a job anymore, and most people don't own stuff because most of the things are owned by somebody else, few other people. And so tell me a little bit about that, because I can see sort of the pre-apocalyptic kind of point of view. So it's not apocalyptic quite yet, but it is definitely pre. And we have a lot of elements such as, for example, the importance of blockchains, the importance of perhaps technological unemployment, highly present everywhere, the impact of climate change, gamification, and all those kind of trends coming together.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have been, again, describing the book as my augmented reality, blockchain, virtual economics, live action role-playing story. And one of the reasons that you might have had the experience you had with the book for the first third or so is that I came to understand as I was writing it that I had to lead the reader down the garden path to what I was trying to say. I couldn't just show it all, and I couldn't tell. I had to let you be inside Sura's head for a while she went through her moment of confusion and worked things out and figured out what was actually important now in this moment. And it's a world where, companies like Amazon are doing massive simulations on their customers so that they can get products manufactured just in time, 24 hours before they know someone is going to want it. So it's not a market economy anymore that people are living in. It's a planned economy.
Exactly.
It's a decentralized corporate planned economy.
Well, the decentralization is maybe more like an oligopoly rather than decentralized, because there's like 4 or 5 centers in 4 or 5 major, the big 5 tech companies.
Sure.
And so it's not like multi-centered with no center of dominance, but we have 5 dominant ones, and then so it's more of an oligopolistic.
Yeah, and in this very near future, we're edging towards the world having its first trillionaire. Inequality has grown massively, while at the same time,
very much like our world right now.
Oh yeah, fewer and fewer people own anything. There are services and there are rentals, and so everyone feels like they're sort of skating across the surface of a world that's been made by and for other people.
I was just listening 2 days ago that unfortunately 60% of the population in the United States do not have $500 cash stuffed away for emergencies. Mm-hmm. So for 60%, and $500 is not such a large amount of money, but if there's like an accident or some kind of medical bill or something out of the predictable ordinary worth $500, they will have to take a loan to cover that up. They do not have $500 away for an emergency fund. That's 200 million people in the richest country in the world.
Yes.
That blew my mind.
Yeah. And it's just one instance or one case of what's going on. For instance, Sura, when she wants to go somewhere, she'll just walk outside and flag down a car. Because cars are autonomous, anyone who owns a car will just let it do a rideshare thing when they don't want to use it.
So it makes them money, yeah.
Yeah, they don't have to park it. It drives around 24 hours a day.
Elon Musk said that would be the case with a Tesla 3 years ago.
Sure. Or
something. It hasn't turned out to be the case yet, but he promised that in 2017, I think.
Yeah, so what happens, and I don't really talk about this in the book, but one of the things that happens is the price of cars shoots up while the number of cars goes down. Fewer and fewer people actually own a car because you don't need to. You just hail one.
Right.
So the people who do own cars make a lot of money off them. They're essentially rentiers.
Right.
But the vast majority of people don't. And this has been, for the 20th century, at least in North America, one of the defining symbols of the middle class, automobile ownership.
Right. And it had to do a lot with personal freedom and...
Yeah. And suddenly that's gone, right? But it's gone in an insidious sort of way. Sure, I've got the personal freedom, but I still don't have $500 that I could, right? And I certainly don't have the down payment for a real car. But I don't really notice that so much. It's somewhat similar to in the 1970s when real wages stopped rising.
Right.
While productivity was still
kept
going
increasing,
up.
Yes.
What we got then was not raises, we got credit cards.
Right.
So when you have credit, you have the illusion that you've got money.
Right.
While in fact you don't.
Right.
And it will cost you more, in fact, to buy things than it would have.
And it would actually shrink your freedom.
Right.
So you would have freedom in the moment, but actually in the future it would put further bigger limitations on you because it comes with interest payments and then interest on the interest. So it actually shrinks your future possibilities.
That's right. So imagine this gigantic surveillance state, only it's a corporate entity largely that is doing surveillance and simulation of you and everyone you know to anticipate economically in place of a market. Although it has, there are stock markets. They're kind of the sham front of this deeper surveillance state. But this is where people live, and they don't have real jobs. They have various mixed jobs that come and go. There's no stability.
It's the gig economy.
It is and it has eaten everything except for a small, very, very traditionalist, mostly white middle class who still have their picket fences and their corner stores and their cars and think that this is how the world really is. Mm-hmm. And they're the ones for whom all the electoral boundaries have been gerrymandered, right?
A curious side idea or side question, which is kind of not relevant, but still I hope interesting, is like, okay, I see those people that you're telling me about just now, but what happens to the Amish? Would they also be a community like that in that kind of world is what I'm trying to figure out here, because in a way they kind of live in their own bubble and technology changes, but they remain the same. And it seems that we have created the space for them to sustain that. Mm-hmm. So I think even in that world that you're describing, maybe they would still sustain themselves in that bubble, or
I think the Amish could because they own land.
Yeah, that's so they can still continue. They have basically subsistence farming to help mm-hmm. them out.
Yeah, according to Thomas Piketty, land ownership is one of the last remaining ways to have any kind of economic autonomy in North America.
And the reason why I'm bringing that up is that because, so it seems that if you're very much on the cutting edge of the technology, then you can be one of those billionaires or trillionaires mm-hmm. and sort of manipulate the world and the technology to your own personal benefit. If you're somewhere in the middle, then you're kind of probably very vulnerable, like most people. You're part of the system, but yet you're very vulnerable if you're working for GM or one of the factories or whatever. And yet, if you're outside of the system almost completely like the Amish, you're kind of also protected in a way, or mm-hmm. secluded or separated from the worst of it. So I find that very interesting. Somehow you can survive outside of the system on top of it, but if you're in the middle, you're basically screwed.
Yes. If you're trying to live by the rules of the system, then yes, you're screwed. And if you try and fight the system, you're screwed. But there's a third choice, and this is what Sura discovers in the book, that all of these resources are underused. As long as something has one identity economically and one purpose and one owner, it will function, within that. It'll run on that track. It'll do that one thing.
It will never be free, and it would always be limited. I think that was a key part of your book that I had to reread like 3 or 4 times. And you're talking about the hammer as an example.
Yes, this idea comes from Heidegger, what he calls tool consciousness. So you have a hammer, and you use it for hammering nails, and all you ever really notice is that you're hammering nails. You never notice the hammer until it breaks, and suddenly you have a startled moment where you're holding a thing in your hands that suddenly is its own unique identity.
Because it's no longer a hammer.
It's no longer a hammer. It's this. And you suddenly have a relationship with it. And it suddenly has maybe potential. So what, well, in foresight, we call this moment strange making. Taking something that you take for granted and flipping it around, and suddenly you see it from a completely different angle, and it's new and full of potential in a way that it wasn't before. So imagine creating...
I think you do that very well during our interviews, which is why I love it so much, and in your books.
Okay.
I think you do that very well.
Yeah. Imagine, though, that we could develop technological aids and systems to help us do this. To strange make the world as we go along, and to see new possibilities and more possibilities in things that we thought only had one identity and one purpose.
But there's a cost, though, because you have to break the hammer, don't you?
Not necessarily, no. Strange making...
Or at least conceptually or in theory.
Yes. There's a cognitive cost to strange making. But in order to make that as easy as possible in the book, they gamify it. Because when you gamify processes or make them part of a narrative, you engage parts of the brain that are optimized for the strange. They're optimized for the new.
And you embrace it.
And you
because
embrace
it's just a game.
Yeah. So...
But it turns out it's not really a game. It's very serious.
Yes. Suddenly you have millions of people wearing smart glasses, which overlay virtual objects onto the real world around them, playing games out in the streets and the parks and everywhere. But they're not just working with virtual things. They are, in fact, finding new ways of using the real things that are out there.
Integrating reality into the game.
Yes.
Real objects, real places.
New realities that use partly virtual and partly real things to do stuff in the interstices between what we would consider to be the real world. And this is how emergence works. So look at it this way. You've got a bunch of atoms, and atoms think that atoms know all the things that are possible, right? They can combine. An atom can't imagine a lake, right? You only get a lake when you get gravity, and you get so many atoms that something new emerges. A planetary surface. Atoms can't imagine chemistry because chemistry doesn't happen on that level. It happens one level above. So atoms can't imagine salt. They can't imagine water, right? These are things that don't live on that level of reality. The interesting thing is that the atoms don't change when salts appear, or when lakes appear, or when biology appears. They're always still there. What's at the sort of bedrock remains the same, but a new possibility arises above it that doesn't depend on the rules of the lower level. And
new possibilities arise there.
That are independent of the...
that didn't exist at that previous level.
That's right. They don't break the rules of the lower level. They come up with their own rules.
They enhance the possibilities, the future options. They expand the sphere of the future possibilities. Is that?
Yeah. So let's say you could imagine doing this with economics and the given things in the world around you, like the hammer, the toolkit, or the workshop, or the factory, or the transportation system, or the computing network, right? where you don't steal resources, but while a car is not being used to drive its driver around, it drives someone else around. When a 3D printer is not printing a job for somebody for money, well, maybe you can bring in your own feedstock and print something of your own, and so on and so forth. And this new level of reality starts to sort of emerge and float on top of the old sort of hyper-capitalist order. So what happens in the book is not that one group of revolutionaries sort of conquers the old way, but they build a new world on top of the old one. It doesn't have to go away. They just emerge from above it.
And that's where I was kind of like, holy cow, I did not see that coming. It's very interesting and brilliant. Now I have to go reread it again and rethink it again. Right? That's the moment. That's kind of like the third part of the book that I was like, okay, now I'm kind of being really challenged here, because the first third was like, okay, I'm not even sure if I'm engaged. I am, but the second part is like, this is getting interesting. The third part is like, holy cow, this is happening and it's bigger and better than I ever expected it would be, kind of deal.
Yeah, if all you see is Sir Neilin running around in a park with smart glasses on waving a pretend sword, in a live action role playing game, it's like, well, sure.
Yeah.
But then, you see her handing off packages to somebody and receiving others, and maybe starts to dawn on you that she's part of a global...
Something's happening.
...set of exchanges that are happening. And these are, again, they're floating above the old economy. Could we do this? I don't know. But what I do know is that we're still using computers to do the things we used to do with pen and paper back in the industrial era, when in fact we probably have the capacity now to, again, simulate the entire economy, to eliminate cash money if we wanted.
Smart contracts, as you talk about, and
sure.
Smart money and distributed intelligence. And by the way, let me ask you here, where does AI fit within that whole picture, whether in the book or whether in our current moment?
AI is a bit of a red herring, I think. Who cares if you have a computer that's as smart as a human being? Give me 9 months and I can produce another human being.
But it's going to take 20 years before it can actually do anything worthwhile, probably.
Sure, but we're physically and mentally the ultimate generalists on this planet already. What people want is not artificial intelligence. They want godlike superintelligence that will be able to solve all the problems. But as we've already talked about, to do that, you would have to be able to predict. And once you get the kind of complex adaptive systems that are, for instance, societies, prediction goes out the window. Even a godlike superintelligence can't do it unless it has some new rules of mathematics.
What do you say to people who predicted Trump or Brexit or, whatever such event you could have? Like, there was an AI algorithm, Canadian one, by a company called Blue Dot that predicted the coronavirus outbreak on December 31st, is my understanding, which was about 8 or 9 days before the World Health Organization.
Sure. I would ask, what other predictions has it made?
It made another prediction about the Zika virus jumping from South America into the southern U.S. 5 years ago or so, and it was the first one to predict that virus ended up in Florida.
Yeah, I can see that kind of prediction happening. There's, it's not that prediction cannot be done; it's that certain kinds of prediction can't be done. So it's actually pretty easy to understand. There are things that are absolutely predictable. So I can tell you exactly when the sun will rise at this point in the year 3054, right?
Right. Astrological phenomenon, they have reoccurrence, predictable cycles.
Yeah.
Sure.
And there are trends. And you can do pretty sophisticated extrapolations on trends. And then there are the complex adaptive systems, which include things like tornadoes. So you can, in general, understand tornadoes, right? You can even predict, in general, how many there will be this year and what their usual paths are going to be. But what you cannot do is say a tornado is going to appear right here on this particular day, and it's going to take this particular path across the landscape. Because once it starts, it is its own thing, basically.
You know, what you're talking about here reminds me, 15 years ago when I was at the University of Toronto, I had Thomas Omer Dixon as one of my professors, and he had a couple of books, one of which was The Ingenuity Gap. And he had an experiment exactly proving your point, and I actually argued with him, and he called me out, and we did the experiment together. Mm-hmm. And he had basically two pendulums. And the idea was, okay, you start off these two pendulums absolutely perfectly in synchrony if you can, like he asked me, right? Mm-hmm. Hold them exactly identical, let both of them go exactly in the same way. And then within a very short time, they're completely doing totally different things, each of them. Mm-hmm. So I tried that a number of times, and in the end, I was able to kind of make it be in sync for like a impressive period of time, like a minute. Mm. And then at a certain point, it was again totally, they were both entirely unpredictable and totally disengaged and out of synchrony. And that was exactly his point, is that's hence I think why he was also talking about the ingenuity gap and the our inability to actually predict those systems, even with the help of super powerful computers and maybe AI.
Yeah, and it's interesting that if you...
And pendulums are very simple, relatively speaking, devices.
Yes.
Our society and our civilization is infinitely more complex, is the idea here. So that makes it several order of magnitudes harder to predict anything.
Yeah, I don't think the Chinese government predicted the coronavirus outbreak. So what effect that's going to have domestically on their politics is anybody's guess.
And that's the most, one of the most interesting implications now are that, okay, we know there will be an economic impact on the world economy and all those things, but China's authoritarian regime may be challenged in some ways because they tried to suppress that news in the beginning. The police went to speak to that doctor originally and told him to stop spreading fake news. The Chinese doctor who originally first started spreading the warnings about the coronavirus outbreak, and unfortunately he's now dead. And of course, when you're in an authoritarian regime at the top, the ones below you want to get your approval, and therefore they're not very incentivized to share bad news or to share exactly the extent of how bad the situation is. Zainab Tayoub, I think is her name, had a fantastic article about how authoritarianism actually has much harder time dealing with outbreaks such as Zika than an open democracy where you can much faster spread the news. But then we'll see, because in China, the numbers are dropping now, mm-hmm. and everywhere else, including in the sort of democratic world, they're on the rise. And in Italy right now is one of the hotbeds in Europe. Right.
So you can ask the Ross Ashby question of which is the better strategy for control right now in China. You, in the case of the pendulums, were temporarily able to sort of steer the system, right?
Yeah, maybe for 45 seconds, maybe a minute, but that was like impressive on the one hand, but yet it was nothing really.
Right, and so a government can, to a greater or lesser extent, steer depending on the resources that it pours in. It's again not a black and white thing of either being able to control the system or not.
Right.
But it gets increasingly difficult, and at a certain point, the whole thing gets away from you. And can you steer a tornado? Probably not. So it comes back to the...
What about those people who say that one of the reasons why we need to create artificial intelligence is because it will help us solve all of our biggest problems, including climate change, including maybe even nuclear proliferation or confrontation, including cancer, including, you know, crop failure. Basically, it's kind of like including the coronavirus and all of these things.
People who are saying that are conflating all kinds of different situations as if they were all problems of the same kind. Now, sure, you can probably have a godlike AI cure cancer very quickly, but you cannot solve the problem of global warming because it's not a problem, it's a constraint. What we have now is we have a gigantic pulse of heat that's moving through the Earth's systems, and primarily through the ocean. And it is moving deeper and deeper into the ocean on a very gradual scale. So even if you were to turn off the sun today and freeze over the top of the planet, that pulse of heat is still moving through the ocean. In other words, there's inertia there that you cannot treat as a problem to be solved.
And there's a delay effect.
And there's a delay. So rather than being a problem, it is now a constraint on our actions. It's a brute fact.
So are we misguided then if we're trying to, quote, solve climate change once and for all? Or should we rather refocus and change both the narrative along lines that you're suggesting, that instead we should consider it a constraint and try to seek those infinite possibilities within that constraint?
Both. The thing is that we have to solve the problem of how to divest from fossil fuels. And that is tractable in a way that pulse of heat itself is not. So what we have control over is how many smokestacks we have up.
Right.
Right? How many cars are putting out the CO2.
Yes.
And so
how many animals we eat, how much
right.
Amazon forest we burn.
So we can and we must deal with that. With that new constraint, on the other hand, we do have to take it as the creative spur.
Right. So at least for the near and maybe even medium time future timeline, we have to kind of live with it.
Well, but what I'm saying is that this is that moment when we can do more than just live with it. So let's take two students of the master who is teaching them poetry. And they've been writing epics. And he comes in and he says, okay, for the next 6 months you're writing only haikus, right? Very short set of meters, very, very very And one of the two students says, oh, no, this destroys my creativity, right? How am I going to live with this? And the other student gets really excited and says, this is an opportunity I never would have thought of. What can I do with this? So this is the very moment that humanity finds itself in right now, where we can either, it's a pre-apocalyptic moment, we can either decide, we're done, because the 20th century linear, structured way of doing things that we've had is collapsing around our
Right,
ears.
let's just have pizza and drink beer and watch Netflix until the end of the world.
Exactly, yeah. Or we can say, oh my God, this is a moment of possibility I never would have come to on my own. A moment when we can create something new within this marvelous set of constraints that we've been given.
You know, that reminds me very much to a friend of mine called Jose Cordero. He talks about the Chinese characters of the word crisis. Mm-hmm. Two Chinese characters. The first one designates danger, and the second one designates opportunity.
Right.
Right. So his point is always about, okay, we have to acknowledge the danger, but we should not forget that the next one that stands right next to it is about opportunity. So we shouldn't forget about the opportunity within the crisis, within the danger.
Yeah. So if we stop trying to solve the problem of how do we continue to have what we've got moving forward, and say, well, I've been given, the chance to write a sonata, fast movement, slow movement, fast movement. I've got a sudden constraint. The world has to stop being like this, but it doesn't tell me what it has to be, only what we have to stop doing. And the space of what we can be is still infinite. So
that makes you sound like an optimist. That's amazing.
Optimism is very hard won. It's not naivety. It's something you fight your way to. But if you can do it, it can be genuine. And this is a moment when we can be genuinely optimistic if we choose.
And if we acknowledge the constraints.
Yes.
Because if you deny acknowledging the constraints, the reality, then
they'll catch up to you anyway.
Right. And we had a whole conversation about the fact that you can never escape natural selection in our first interview, which was very illuminating to me. So would that make you an optimist yourself then?
Yeah. Yeah, I am.
Because I was kind of surprised to discover that this book, which took us through so many hard moments and stuff, and then in the end you may be kind of like an optimist.
Sure. And this is the moment for it. And I think personally I have a moral imperative. I have a daughter. As a parent, I cannot be a pessimist. I have to make optimism a choice. And then I have to follow through on that by making it realistic. And not being starry-eyed and a Pollyanna about things. So I'm not going to say, oh, we're going to invent nuclear fusion and artificial, generalized intelligence and the singularity will just pop us out of the situation and we'll all be fine. No. All of the problems are real and they're not going away. Mm-hmm. But we can either be fatalistic or depressed, or we can be eager at this moment. Because we may not be able to solve, but we can improve. And we may not be able to put back together what we once had, but we can make something new. And that new thing, what comes after us, is what I'm most excited to think about and write about.
And still anything is possible, despite that terrible constraint.
Yes. Even though that's all that we focus on, and while we're staring at that wall, all we see is wall, right? We're ignoring everything else that's possible that we're not looking at.
Right. Wow, your book is called Stealing Worlds. I'm going to be stealing words from it for my keynotes and everything else, and the interviews that I go and give. That's brilliant. So, Karl, we have about 15 minutes before we have to wrap it up. So I want to bring two more concepts that I think could help us a lot here in our conversation. And the first one is the idea of technology as a value. Mm. Can you tell me a little bit about that and what do you mean? Because people would say technology is neutral, it doesn't have value, just like engineering or science. It is what it is. Mm-hmm.
Well, I talked a lot about this in Lady of Mazes. And the analogy I gave there is that, the principle is that technology is legislation. So bringing a new technology into the world is the equivalent of legislating some change in society.
Code is law and technology is legislation. Those are the things I remembered from that book.
Right. The Amish actually know this, which is why they are still
so careful about what they embrace.
Yes.
And experimental and suspicious and take their time and do it at their own sort of pace and in their own context and moment of choosing, if they choose so.
Yeah, so they're not anti-technology. They're currently experimenting with cell phones. But it's going to take them a long time to figure out what the impact of cell phones are.
And in a way, that may be the wiser approach, perhaps, mm-hmm. rather than just simply take for granted anything that comes our way.
Right. Because you can imagine technologies the way we implement them right now as being a kind of roulette wheel. We spin the wheel, and it goes round and round and lands on a particular change to us to our society, to us as people.
And then people said, "There's nothing you can do. It is what it is.
It's
you can't stop it."
Randomly chosen. So in Lady of Mazes, I come up with a kind of magical technology that allows you to tune in and tune out what technologies you will allow in your life. So you can say, well, I want to live in a kind of 1910 world where there's telephones, but the mail gets delivered by hand twice a day, and people are still riding horses, although there are cars. And this system, through a sort of combination of virtual reality and physical machinery, makes that world be the world that you live in. And people who have similar tastes gather together in what I call manifolds.
Yeah.
That are living in the same sort of technological moment. But that means they're in a space of shared values. And those shared values are very, very strong. Mm-hmm. In this future sort of utopia, if that's what it is, when you get to be about 16 years old, you start to be able to catch glimpses of the other worlds around yourself. And you get to choose whether you're going to stay in the one that you were raised in or move to another one. Mm-hmm. And
the message here is, even more importantly, I would say, that it goes against the common claim coming usually from Silicon Valley that there's nothing we can do, that you cannot stop technology, that it's inevitable, whether AI or even surveillance, if you will. People are saying, oh, privacy is lost, it's inevitable, like, accept it. And your message is, no, wait a minute. Actually, we can choose, and actually we can control. And we have historical examples in the case of the Amish who do that. Mm-hmm. But we also, I can give you here 10 other examples of sort of fictional places and timelines and characters who are also choosing to do that. So it's not impossible, it is possible.
Yeah. In science fiction, the most famous example would be the Butlerian Jihad from Dune.
Yes.
Where the entire civilization has decided that computers are a threat and just, bad for humanity. And so they just ban them. And it's a far future world with space flight and all kinds of other, advances, but they don't have or use computers.
And that forced certain elements of humanity to evolve to be able to do that kind of computation, the navigators for space flight that previously was done only by computers.
Yeah, that's right. And in our world, we can see a little bit of the ambiguity, why this is a choice and not a something that you can easily dictate in the situation that John Philip Sousa, the composer, found himself in the United States. When the gramophone came in, Sousa sued to have it suppressed. I know, we laugh, right? But he had a very good reason for doing that, because as he had been raised and as he had lived his life, music was something that you did.
Right.
And musicians could make a living by just going from town to town and playing for people.
Right, because every live event basically involved an element of live music.
Yeah. And when the gramophone came in, it destroyed that way of life.
They actually called it canned music for a while. Canned. I even read like 1910 leaflets where people who are trying to fight against the recording of music, and they're like, ban canned music and stuff like that. Right? Yeah. Just like they were trying to say canned food is not real food. Mm-hmm. Canned music is not real music.
Yeah, but there's a tragic ambiguity in it, because he wasn't wrong. It did destroy a way of life, and a really beautiful way of life. But on the other hand, it made it possible for people who could not afford to go to the symphony to listen to Beethoven.
Yeah.
You can argue that was more important. You can argue that the direct experience of performing music is more important, but
so
it's a choice.
whether that's a good or a bad outcome depends not on the outcome, but it depends on the value against which you are judging that outcome.
And therefore we come back to that roulette wheel of values idea,
Exactly.
right?
Yeah.
Where with the technologies that we're developing, we are just randomly spinning the wheel. And not really judging what our real values as people and as a society are.
So in a way, we're playing Russian roulette with technology, and some of it can literally blow us away.
Well, let's come back to the present moment in time, right? With social media and the impact that the freedom of the internet has unexpectedly had on our political institutions. If you go back 20 years, most of the narratives around the internet are really highly utopian about how it's going to open up a future of freedom of choice and discussion and people coming together. We're not quite holding each other's hands and singing Kumbaya in a circle, but the vision was...
Free from government, free from manipulation, free from...
Yeah.
Economic restrictions or anything like that. But it's been anything but that.
That's true. On the other hand, this is, again, still just the technologies that we have right now that are doing this. Within the internet, which is just, it's a medium, we've built a certain kind of media that we're having trouble with right now. But that doesn't mean that there can't be others, or that we can't reform or redesign the media that we have to behave in a different way.
Tim Berners-Lee is actually trying to do something about that right now.
Yeah, and I've made suggestions about how to do it as well. With arguments between people, what often happens is that people are using the same word, but have completely different meanings for it.
Absolutely.
So let's take the word liberal, right?
Or AI. I've noticed in my interviews of 250 interviews on the topic of AI, almost everyone has a different definition of what AI actually means.
Right.
And that's what you would imagine, that's kind of a scientific or engineering term, but actually not. And even when I talked to Stuart Russell, who wrote the most popular textbook on AI, and his answer was like, well, there's only one definition of AI. And it's kind of like in my book, right? And then my answer, and he didn't quite like it, was like, well, I've done 250 of these, and to be honest, not one has quoted your book's definition, right? So, and they're all, quote, experts, or most of them anyway. Mm-hmm. So...
Yeah, so what happens on the internet is that you get this massive argument amplifying machine, which is social media as it's incentivized, where people are using words in ways that are opaque to one another. But if, for instance, every now and then Twitter were to pop up a little query on the side saying, what do you mean when you use the word liberal? Mm-hmm. And allow you to...
Socialist.
Right, socialist. Allow you to define it there, and then start either showing people when you're in a conversation what you mean when you use that word, or harmonizing the conversations that are pushed in your direction to be ones with people who share the same definition, then the amount of misunderstanding fed disagreement is going to start going down. Mm-hmm. So that's a technological fix, but there are also, of course, legislative and social and other ways of addressing the issues. So even in this moment of time when things seem chaotic, there are lots of approaches that can be taken. And the technology that is not neutral is just this particular technology. There are still, again, reasons to be optimistic. If you strange make something like Twitter and turn it around and say, oh, what about this word definition?
I think I'm going to have to ask you for another interview where we only talk about strange making. Mm. And I think that would be a great topic, useful for all of us, I think individually, but also professionally and maybe even collectively. And I think that would be a great tool. Unfortunately, we're really running out of time, so we have maybe 5 minutes or so. So let me just close that loop here about technology as value, because we kind of been talking about technology. Let's talk a tiny little bit about the value part though. Is that within or outside of technology? Because you see, my blogging name is Socrates and I'm supposedly all about ethics. But then the question is that value or that ethics outside or within technology? Is it a reflection of it, or is it a value against which we measure technology, or is it both? Where do you space that?
Yeah, I thought about that a lot when I was writing Lady Amazes, and I don't know that I can answer the question. I think it's a correlationist situation where it's the combination of human society and technology that creates these value situations, that another species with the same technology might have a completely different experience of it. But I just know that technology...
But you can see the Marxist argument too, which says that, you know, the social system, the social values are a reflection of our economic system.
Yeah, they are that as well.
As well, yes.
Right.
That's a good fine-tuning of that point.
Yeah, because again, one of the things I do in Stealing Worlds is basically dismantle economics.
Right.
Down into...
you kind of make it irrelevant, if I may say so. So I don't know if I agree with the word dismantle. In a way, yes, but I think maybe kind of you, as you said, you'd go one level up.
Yeah.
If that makes sense. And I'm sure for our viewers it doesn't make sense. That's why you guys have to read the book, because then it would really make sense towards the end though. So stay with it.
Yeah. But yeah, no, it's true. The economics is a great science for a particular set of technologies at a particular time in human development. Our society, with the technologies we have right now, well, maybe we really are getting post-economic. It's and that's not post-scarcity. That's not the Star Trek future of that I'm talking about. No, it's where technology can directly serve our social and personal needs without the intervention of intermediaries like money, because they are a medium.
Absolutely.
Right, that we've used. It's a medium of convenience that we've been using for about 3,500 to 5,000 years.
And maybe they were useful for that time, but maybe they're no longer so.
Right, because all of a sudden we have, maybe not godlike AI, but we have computing systems that can outrun the capacities of these old systems like crazy.
And hence you bring in smart contracts and blockchain and all those things in your book.
And yeah, basically invented temporary economies that exist as long as they're necessary and then just evaporate as if a game were ending.
Right, and those are all fascinating ideas. And where does the design, sort of the relevance or impact of design as a principle come within that kind of world making and sort of like imagining or even foresight, if you will?
There's a discipline, new discipline called transition design, which is all about using visions of the future, of a successful future, typically, as touchstones for design, whether it's service design, social design, but actual real-world activities. Not saying this is the world we are going to make, this is the future, but saying this is the pre-apocalyptic moment, these are the possibilities. What would happen if we designed in this direction? It's steering rather than controlling. And
which is where the word cyber comes from.
Right. Yeah.
Cyber comes from if I remember correctly, the steering of a ship in Greek, in ancient Greek.
Yeah, the Kubernetes, who was the steersman. Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's again.
You know your ancient Greek too. Wow, good for you.
It's not assuming that you can control the system, but it is the idea that with startling and provocative visions of possible tomorrows, we can, to some extent, steer our way towards a better world.
Wow, that's. I think this is a good point to kind of start bringing our conversation to an end. And it's going to leave us a little open-ended to a follow-up conversation, hopefully much sooner than 8 years later from now. So let me just ask you, what's next for Karl Schroeder? What can you tell us for your near-term future?
Sure.
That's more predictable and linear.
Well, I am working on a new book, which is all about this possibility of creativity under constraint. So accepting the world of global warming that we're moving into, looking a little farther out than with stealing worlds, say 30 or 40 years, how can the people living in that era be eager rather than resigned?
Mm-hmm. Because one of the arguments against this that I have heard from, let's say, transhumanist community and others, entrepreneurs and optimists, or techno-optimists, I should say, is that accepting something means that you've lost already. And so they say categorically, in principle, we shouldn't be accepting climate change. We shouldn't be accepting it because that means we're not going to do much about it. So we shouldn't accept it because maybe we'll fail to change it. But the only way we could change it is, or the only hope of us having chance of changing it is if we absolutely categorically deny accepting it and try to figure out what to do about it and how not to accept it.
Right.
Does that make sense?
It does make sense, and it's a logical strategy for facing off against the fossil fuel industry. So what we cannot afford to accept is business as usual, or fatalistic resignation to continued emissions growth.
Right.
But that's very different from saying that we have to deny the presence of this change
as a fact.
As a fact.
Yeah. And I think that pulse of heat that you're saying at purely the physics level is actually a very good way of explaining it. Again, it never occurred to me to think of it this way, but I think it's very well put.
Yeah. This is the condition of our lives at this point. But once again, it's you can view it as an amputation, or you can view it as the creative constraint for a new kind of art.
And a new kind of beginning. That could be actually better in the end.
Yeah.
Yeah, just like in photography with a single fixed focal length, you may end up doing better photography than with a whole suitcase full of lenses and cameras and then start wondering, oh, which one should I pick up right now? What focal length, what size of sensor and all that stuff. And in the end, you do terrible photography.
Yeah. Yeah. So what beautiful thing are we going to be forced to make in the next 100 years?
What beautiful thing are we going to be forced to make? Wow, I can't even think of a better way to wrap this up. Wow. Okay, Karl, where can people find more about this kind of work of yours and more about you in general?
Sure.
What's the best place?
I think it would be great to look at transition design and discursive design, but definitely transition design. Strategic foresight and foresight, they have a lot to teach us right now. My own work is mostly in the fiction realm, and you can find Stealing Worlds and my other books on Amazon or in local bookstores everywhere.
And your website is
Schroeder. kschroeder.com.
Was there a dot or is it just one word? Schroeder.
Schroeder.
Yeah, .com.
And I have a website for my foresight work, which is called narrativefutures.com.
Yeah, and I think that's brilliant. And we have another whole conversation about the importance of narratives that we never had chance to get to touch on. But that's another possible topic for a follow-up interview. So, Karl, we've talked today for, I'd say, a little less than 2 hours, like an hour and 50 minutes perhaps. One amazing idea just at the end is like what beautiful things we may be forced to create or futures we may be forced to create. Is that the parting thought that you want us to leave with, or do you Can you go one up on that?
No, I might restate it, but really, yeah, we are living in the moment of creative possibility, and if we collectively see the world this way, so much is possible. And to bring this actually back around to the idea of the technological singularity, one of the reasons why I am not a fan of the singularity is that for me it represents the linear 20th century vision of limitless possibility based upon the power being granted to us or being sort of taken from the gods, the Prometheus sort of
myth.
vision. Yeah.
Just like he gave fire to the humans, he gave AI or intelligence, artificial intelligence to humanity and the world, and the universe wakes up.
Yes. And the problem is that global warming puts the lie to that, because that pulse of heat that I referred to is indifferent to all of our interventions.
And it's not about intelligence, but physics.
Yeah. No amount of intelligence removes the fact of the warming of the lower strata of the ocean. And there's no way to think your way around that problem. So what we need a different reason to be optimistic. And for me, creativity under constraint is that reason. It is that new way of looking at the world. Taking global warming as the constraint that creates an art form.
In a way, is it like, civilizationally speaking, we are kind of close to or already burning the ships?
Yeah.
And so we're going to be in a new world, if I may say it that way. And the old world, the ships, everything we know of that we used so far is kind of dismantling or being dismantled right now. But yet we may discover a new world or create a new world that's actually better than the old world.
Yeah, and this exact moment in history is when we are huddled on the shore, looking back and mourning what we had. But
instead, you're suggesting we should turn 180 degrees and look forth and say, hey, it's a new big world out there. Let's see what we can make out of it.
Exactly.
Karl Schroeder, it's been another fascinating 2 hours with you. Thank you so much.
Thanks. It was great to be here.
If you guys enjoyed this show, you can help me make it better in a couple of ways. You can go and write a review on iTunes, or you can simply make a donation.